Silas stood in the warm dust of the barn, staring down at the heavy leather saddle resting on the dirt floor. His chest heaved with shallow, frustrated breaths. A deep, sickening ache burned through his right shoulder, the lingering curse of a violent fall from a Greenbroke horse 3 weeks ago. He gritted his teeth, reached down with his left hand, and grabbed the saddle horn. He braced his boots, trying to heave the heavy rig up and over the back of his waiting bay mare. Pain flared hot and bright, shooting down his arm and across his collarbone. His grip failed. The saddle slipped from his hand, crashing back to the dirt and kicking up a cloud of loose straw. Silas leaned his forehead against the wooden stall, squeezing his eyes shut. A terrible, hollow truth settled in his gut. A rancher who could not even saddle his own horse was a man who had outlived his usefulness. He rubbed his ruined shoulder, wondering how long he could hide his failure before the bank took the property. A wide shadow fell across the sunlit doorway of the barn. Silas turned, instinctively hiding his injured arm behind his back. He expected to see a neighbor coming to collect a debt. Instead, a woman stood in the entrance. She was not like any woman Silas had ever seen. She was massive, towering an easy 3 inches over his own 6-foot frame. Her build was extraordinary, heavily muscled and thick with power. She wore a simple slate blue dress that had been roughly torn at the sleeves, leaving her incredibly thick, sun-baked biceps exposed to the open air. Her heavy thighs pressed against the fabric of her skirt, and thick, chunky leather boots covered her feet. She was covered in the pale dust of the open road, her long blonde hair messy and wild around a strong, resolute face. She did not say a word at first. She just looked at him, and then she looked at the heavy saddle lying in the dirt. Silas felt his face flush with dark, stinging pride. He stepped forward, raising his chin to project a strength he did not possess. He opened his mouth to tell the stranger that this was private land and she needed to keep. But before he could form the words, the giant woman stepped into the barn. She moved with surprising quietness for a person of her enormous size. She walked past him, her broad shoulders brushing the sunlight. She reached down, took the saddle horn in one massive hand, and lifted the 40-pound rig as if it weighed no more than a winter coat. With a gentle, practiced motion, she settled it perfectly onto the back of the mare. The horse did not flinch, sensing the calm authority in the giant woman's touch. I reckon we have all faced a moment where our pride was the heaviest burden we carried, the kind of weight that threatens to break a man in half. If you are settling in to hear this one, let me know where you are listening from tonight. Silas stood perfectly still, his jaw tight. He felt naked, stripped of his dignity in his own barn. He waited for the pity in her eyes. He waited for the mocking smile that usually followed when someone realized a man was broken. The woman turned to face him. Her blue eyes were clear, steady, and utterly devoid of pity. "I am looking for a place to stop walking," she said. Her voice was surprisingly soft, carrying a low, steady rhythm. "My name is Matilda. I saw you struggling from the road." Silas stiffened. "I was managing just fine." Matilda looked at his right shoulder, then back to his eyes. "No, you were not," she said simply. There was no cruelty in her observation, only fact. "You have a hurt wing. You have a roof missing shingles on the wash house, fences leaning south along the main road, and a woodpile that looks like it has not been touched in a month. You are running out of time, mister. I do not have the money to hire a man, let alone a woman," Silas said harshly, his pride bleeding into his tone. "Cannot pay wages. You are wasting your time stopping here." "I did not ask for money," Matilda replied. She crossed her thick, muscular arms over her chest. "I asked for a place to stop walking. I will make you a deal. I will do the heavy lifting. I will swing the hammer, dig the posts, chop the wood, and saddle your horse. In return, I want a dry corner in the barn, 3 meals a day, and your word that you will not ask me any questions about where I came from." Silas stared at her. He looked at her sheer size, the terrifying physical power evident in her shoulders and legs. It was an absurd proposition. A decent frontierman did not let a woman do the backbreaking labor of a ranch. But as another sharp throb of pain radiated from his collarbone, the reality of his situation crushed his pride. If he said no, he would lose the ranch by winter. You would do all that just for meals and a spot in the barn? Silas asked, his voice dropping to a cautious murmur. Matilda held his gaze. I have slept in worse places for a lot less. Do we have a deal, mister? Silas hesitated for a long moment. He extended his good left hand. The name is Silas, and we have a deal. Her massive, calloused hand engulfed his. Her grip firm but incredibly restrained. She gave a single nod. As she turned to walk toward the broken wash house, the sunlight caught her back. Silas noticed that beneath the dust on her powerful arms, faded bruises shaped like grasping fingers marked her skin. He watched the giant woman walk across his yard, suddenly realizing that he was not the only one in this bargain running out of time. The sharp crack of splitting timber echoed across the dusty yard, pulling Silas from a fitful morning sleep. He dressed slowly, his jaw tight as he navigated buttoning his faded canvas shirt with his left hand. His right shoulder radiated a deep, sickening heat. Every movement was a negotiation with pain. Stepping onto the front porch, Silas watched in quiet disbelief. Matilda was at the woodpile. She swung the heavy iron-splitting maul with terrifying, effortless power. Her thick biceps bunched and flexed beneath her sun-baked skin with every downward stroke. Heavy oak logs that would have taken Silas 3 strikes to split burst apart under her single blows. She did not breathe heavily. She moved with a steady, relentless rhythm, her chunky leather boots planted firmly in the dirt. Silas looked from her towering frame to his own trembling right hand. A bitter wave of uselessness washed over him. Determined to reclaim some fraction of his dignity, he walked toward the iron water pump. The bay mare nickered from the corral. Silas grabbed the heavy wooden bucket with his left hand and pumped the handle. When the bucket was full, habit betrayed him. He forgot his ruined shoulder and tried to brace the heavy load with his right hand to lift. White-hot agony ripped through his collarbone. Silas gasped, his vision going black. The bucket slipped from his deadened fingers, crashing to the dirt and spilling cold water over his boots. He staggered back, gripping his right arm against his ribs, fighting the urge to vomit. The chopping stopped. Silas closed his eyes, turning his face away as he heard her steady footsteps crossing the yard. Leave it, Silas managed to say, his voice breathless. I can fetch my own water. Matilda stopped beside him, her massive shadow offering relief from the morning sun. She did not offer pity. She stepped past him, picked up the bucket, pumped it full with one hand, and carried it to the corral. She lifted it over the top rail as if it were a teacup. The bay mare trotted over, lowering her head. Matilda stroked the mare between the ears. Her massive hand was incredibly gentle, moving with a quiet patience the animal immediately trusted. A man who cannot water his own stock has no business owning a ranch, Silas said bitterly. Matilda turned around, resting her thick arms on the corral rail. A man who cannot admit he is hurt has no business making deals, she replied softly. I told you I would do the heavy lifting. That includes the water. It is not right. A woman should not do a man's labor while he watches. I have done men's labor my whole life, she said. Mostly because men told me I was too big to be a proper woman, but too useful to turn away. Do not let your pride make you stupid. We have a bargain. By midday, the woodpile was stacked and the missing shingles on the wash house roof had been replaced. Silas prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. When they sat at the small wooden table, he noticed Matilda took only a tiny portion. She was 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle, burning tremendous energy. Yet she ate like a bird, keeping her massive arms pulled tight against her sides as if trying to take up less space. Silas pushed the iron pot across the table. Eat. She hesitated. I had my share. I do not want to eat you out of house and home. You chopped a cord of wood and fixed my roof, Silas said, his voice firm but without anger. You eat what you earned, Matilda. I do not starve my hands. She looked up at him. She reached for the spoon, a quiet gratitude in her steady blue eyes. That evening, the heat in Silas's shoulder spread deep into his chest. A fever took hold. He went to the barn to check the mare, hoping the cool air would clear his head. Instead, a wave of dizziness hit him so hard he dropped to his knees in the straw. Matilda stepped out from her corner, her tall frame blocking the lantern light. "You are burning up," she said. "I am fine," Silas rasped, trying to push himself up. Matilda stepped closer, kneeling beside him. She reached out toward his injured shoulder. Silas flinched away. "Do not touch me," he ordered, panic and pride making him cruel. "Keep to your side of the barn. Do not pretend you care." Matilda froze. The lantern light caught the faded bruises on her forearm. "Because I know what it is like when the world decides you are broken," she said quietly, lowering her hand. "And I know what happens when you try to fix it all by yourself." Silas felt a sharp sting of regret. Before he could apologize, heavy hoofbeats echoed in the yard. "Silas!" A harsh voice yelled from the front porch. "Silas, you in there? It is Miller. I came to collect on the banknote." Silas went completely still, his heart hammering. Miller was the neighboring rancher who held his debt. If Miller saw him kneeling in the dirt, shaking with fever, he would claim the ranch by morning. Silas tried to force himself to his feet, but his legs refused to hold him. He swayed, about to fall. Matilda moved instantly. She caught him by his good arm, hauling him upright with effortless power, her massive body supporting his entire weight. She held him steady as heavy footsteps moved from the porch toward the yard. "What do we do?" she asked softly, the word "we" hanging like a dangerous promise in the quiet dark. Silas leaned his left shoulder against the heavy timber of the stall, locking his knees to keep from collapsing. Matilda stepped back into the shadows, but she kept one massive hand pressed flat against the small of his back. Her strength poured into him, an immovable iron anchor keeping him upright as heavy boots crunched into the barn. Miller was a thick, impatient man who viewed his neighbor's misfortunes as personal opportunities. He swaggered into the lantern light, barely glancing at Silas's pale, sweat-slicked bank draft did not clear. "Silas, I am not running a charity. You give me the bay mare tonight, or I bring the sheriff for the deed on Monday." "The mare is not for sale," Silas said, his voice tight with suppressed agony. "It was not an offer," Miller sneered, stepping forward with a leather halter. Matilda moved. She stepped out from the shadows, her towering frame catching the yellow light. Miller stopped dead. His eyes widened as he took in her exceptional height and the terrifying width of her sun-baked shoulders. Beside her, Miller suddenly looked like a small, soft man. "The mare stays," Matilda said. Her voice was low and perfectly calm. "You have a mile of broken fence along the south ridge. I will dig the posts and string the wire by Sunday. That covers the interest for the month." Miller stared at the sheer muscular power in her thick biceps and heavy thighs, calculating the value of the backbreaking labor. "I do not know what kind of draft horse you hired," Silas, Miller muttered, his courage faltering under Matilda's steady blue gaze. "But she better have that fence tight by Sunday." He turned and left without another word. The moment the hoofbeats faded from the yard, Silas's knees buckled. Matilda caught him instantly. She did not struggle with his dead weight. She simply scooped him up, her massive arms cradling him against her chest as easily as if he were a child. "Put me down," Silas gritted out, shame burning hotter than his fever. "Quiet," she said gently. She carried him across the dark yard and into the small farmhouse, laying him carefully on the bed. Silas drifted in and out of a fiery haze. When he opened his eyes again, the room was dimly lit. Matilda was sitting in the wooden chair beside the bed, wringing a cool, damp cloth over a tin basin. She reached out and pressed the cloth to his forehead. Silas did not flinch away this time. He lay still, stripped of his pride, watching her. For a woman of such imposing size, her hands were incredibly light. She moved with a quiet dignity, asking for nothing, judging him for nothing. "You should not have promised him the fence," Silas whispered, his voice rough. "That is hard ground. 3 men could not dig that line by Sunday." "I have dug harder ground," Matilda replied softly. She dipped the cloth again. As she reached forward, the torn sleeve of her slate-blue dress shifted, exposing the faded, finger-shaped bruises on her heavy forearm. Silas remembered how he had ordered her not to touch him earlier, realizing now that his words must have sounded like every cruel voice she had ever fled. "Who gave you those?" Silas asked, his gaze fixed on her arm. Matilda paused. She looked down at the marks, her strong jaw tightening. "Men who thought a woman my size was a freak of nature," she said, her voice dropping to a quiet, painful honesty. "Men who wanted to see if I could fight like a bear or pull a wagon for a crowd. The world does not like things it cannot easily categorize, Silas. It either tries to use them or it tries to break them." Silas felt a sharp ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his fever. "I am sorry I spoke harshly to you," he said. Matilda looked up, surprised by the apology. A soft, vulnerable warmth flickered in her steady blue eyes. "Rest your shoulder," she murmured. For the next 3 days, a strange peace settled over the struggling ranch. The fever finally broke. Silas spent his hours resting on the porch, watching as Matilda worked. She was a force of nature. She was up before dawn, hauling heavy timber, sinking posts, and fixing what was broken. The ranch began to look alive again. It was a temporary success, a false dawn that made Silas believe they might actually survive the season. But on the 4th afternoon, Silas felt strong enough to walk the mile to the south ridge to bring her a canteen of water. As he approached the property line, he stopped behind a stand of cottonwood trees. Matilda was there, driving a heavy iron digging bar into the rocky soil. Her muscles strained against the slate-blue fabric, sweat shining on her brow. But she was not alone. 3 of Miller's ranch hands sat on the top rail of the finished fence. They were tossing pebbles at her, laughing, and whistling like she was a sideshow attraction. "Come on, giant," one of them jeered. "Show us how much you can lift. Bend that iron bar." Matilda did not look up. She kept her head down, her jaw locked in silent humiliation, taking the ridicule without a single word just so Silas's debt would be paid. Silas gripped the canteen, his knuckles turning white. He realized the terrible cost of their bargain. He had kept his ranch, but the price was her dignity. As he stood in the shadows of the trees, a cold, heavy truth settled over him. If he walked out there as a broken man, he could not defend her. But if he stayed hidden, he was no better than the men who had bruised her arms. Silas stepped out from the shadow of the cottonwood trees, his boots crunching heavily in the dry grass. His right arm hung useless at his side, but his head was held high and his jaw was set like. He did not look at the heavy iron digging bar in Matilda's hands. He looked straight at the 3 men sitting on the fence. "That is enough," Silas said. His voice was low, but it carried across the open ridge with a quiet authority that made the hands stop laughing. The lead hand, a lean man named Pete, spat a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the dirt. "Well, look here, boys." The broken rancher came out to watch his draft horse work. "You gonna saddle her up next, Silas?" Silas stepped directly between the men and Matilda, using his broad frame to block her from their sight. "You are on my land," Silas said, his eyes hard, "and you are speaking to a woman who has done more honest work in 3 days than the 3 of you have managed all summer. Pick up your hats and get off my ridge." Pete sneered, reaching for the reins of his horse tied to a nearby post. "You cannot enforce that, Silas. You cannot even lift a coffee pot with that shoulder." "I do not need 2 good arms to know how to handle trespassing trash," Silas replied, his voice deadly steady. "And Miller might hold my note, but until Monday, this dirt belongs to me. Move along before I go back to the house for my rifle." The hands exchanged uneasy glances. They were cruel men, but they were cowards when confronted by a man who showed no fear. With muttered curses, they climbed into their saddles and turned their horses south, kicking up a cloud of pale dust as they galloped away. The ridge went quiet again, save for the dry wind whispering through the grass. Silas turned around slowly. Matilda stood motionless, holding the iron bar against her chest. Her long blonde hair had pulled loose from its tie, falling around her face. Her broad shoulders were tight, her heavy biceps flexed from hours of pounding rock, but her blue eyes were wide, filled with an intense, startled vulnerability. "You should not have done that," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "They could have hurt you. You are in no condition to fight 3 men. A man does not have to be able to throw a punch to know what is right," Silas said quietly. He walked closer, taking the heavy water canteen from his belt with his left hand and holding it out to her. "You are not a spectacle, Matilda. Not on my land. Not while I am breathing." Matilda stared at the canteen, then at his face. A heavy swallow worked down her throat. For years, people had either run from her size or used it as an excuse to treat her like livestock. No man had ever stood between her and a cruel word. No man had ever risked his own safety to protect her dignity. She reached out and took the canteen, her fingers briefly brushing his. "Thank you, Silas," she said softly. For the rest of the afternoon, they worked side by side. Silas could not swing the sledgehammer, but he used his left hand to hold the thick cedar posts steady in the deep holes while Matilda drove them home with massive, rhythmic strikes. They did not speak much, but the tension between them had changed. It was no longer the awkward arrangement of a desperate rancher and a muscular outcast. It was the synchronized labor of 2 people who had found a sudden, unexpected shelter in each other. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of gold and amber, they walked back toward the homestead. The south fence line was finished, straight and tight against the prairie. Sitting on the porch steps that night, Silas handed Matilda a tin cup of fresh black coffee. He looked at her tired hands resting in her lap. "Why did you stop here, Matilda?" he asked gently. "Truly, you could have walked to the town 4 miles north. They have a hotel and a livery. You could have found easier work." Matilda took a sip of the hot liquid, looking out over the dark corral. "I was in town 2 weeks ago," she said quietly. "I was sitting behind the blacksmith shop trying to stay out of sight. I saw a runaway supply wagon come down the main street. The horses were panicked. A small farm dog was chained near the trough, right in the wagon's path." Silas quieted, listening. "I saw a cowboy run out from the porch," Matilda continued, turning her eyes to meet his. "He did not have time to get out of the way. He grabbed the dog's chain and threw the animal clear, taking the full force of the wagon shaft right against his right shoulder. He fell into the dirt, but he never made a sound. He just picked up the dog, checked if it was hurt, and walked away." Silas rubbed his scarred shoulder, realization dawning on him. "I knew right then what kind of man lived on this ranch," Matilda said, her voice rich with a quiet warmth. "I knew you were a man who protected things that were smaller or weaker than yourself, even if it cost you everything. I did not stop here looking for a job, Silas. I stopped here because I wanted to be near someone who understood what it meant to carry a burden for someone else." The revelation settled in Silas's chest, warm and deep. He looked at her strong, resolute face, seeing her not as a giant woman, but as the most courageous soul he had ever met. Before he could speak, the quiet of the night was shattered by the sharp clatter of iron horseshoes on the rocky road. 2 lanterns cut through the darkness as 3 horses pulled up to the porch. Miller sat high in his saddle, flanked by 2 armed men wearing deputy badges. "Evening, Silas," Miller called out, his voice sharp and triumphant. "I saw the fence. Nice work, but circumstances have changed." Silas stood up, stepping in front of Matilda on the porch. "The fence was the deal, Miller. The interest is paid. The interest on the old draft is paid, yes," Miller sneered, pulling a legal document from his heavy coat. "But I bought up your county tax lien this morning. $500 in back taxes, Silas. You pay me in full by Monday morning, or the county auctioneer puts this ranch on the block." $500 was a fortune, an impossible sum for a struggling rancher with a ruined arm. Silas felt the ground pull away beneath his feet. Miller leaned forward on his saddle horn, his eyes sliding past Silas to lock onto Matilda's towering frame. "Of course, I am a reasonable neighbor," Miller said with a slick, greasy smile. "A logging company up in the hills needs heavy haulers. They will pay top dollar for a worker with muscle like hers. You sign over her labor contract to me for 2 years, Silas, and I will tear up this tax deed right now." Silas went rigid, his blood turning to ice. Matilda stepped up beside him, her broad chest heaving as she understood the trap. Miller grinned in the dark lantern light. "You have until Monday morning, Silas. Your land or the giant woman." The lantern light cast long, shifting shadows across the porch as Miller's ultimatum hung in the night air. Silas stepped forward, instinctively reaching with his left hand to shield Matilda, though she towered over him. "She is not a piece of property, Miller," Silas said, his voice cutting through the dark like a rusted iron blade. "She is a free woman. I do not own her, and I do not sell human beings to save my own skin." Miller chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He reached into his heavy coat, pulled out a folded logging company labor contract, and tossed it onto the porch boards at Silas's feet. "Pride is a heavy meal, Silas. It goes down rough when you are starving. You think about it. Monday morning I come for the deed." Miller yanked his reins, and the 3 riders turned their horses, galloping back toward the main road. The sound of hoofbeats faded, leaving only the hollow whisper of the prairie wind. Matilda stared at the white paper resting in the dirt. She slowly stepped down from the porch and picked it up. Her massive fingers trembled slightly as she looked at the bold print of the timber outfit. "You should have said yes," she said softly, not meeting his eyes. 2 years of felling timber is nothing to me, Silas. I have worked harder camps for less." Silas walked down the steps. He stopped in front of her, forcing her to look at him. His face was pale, lined with exhaustion and pain, but his eyes were fiercely. "Do not ever say that," Silas commanded quietly. "Do not ever speak of yourself as if you are just a strong back to be traded. You are not a draft horse. You are not a commodity. You are Matilda, and I would watch this house burn to the ground before I let another man put a yoke around your neck." Matilda's breath hitched. For her entire adult life, her extraordinary size had made her a target. Men had treated her as an attraction, a worker, a freak, or a threat. No one had ever looked at her and simply seen a woman worth protecting. A hot, silent tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with her heavy wrist. "Silas, it is $500. Where will you get that kind of money by Monday?" "I will find a way," Silas said, turning toward the house. "Even if I have to sell everything I own to do it." Saturday broke hot and unforgiving. Silas refused to stay in the chair. Driven by desperate responsibility, he spent the entire day riding the bay mare through the deep brush of the southern ravine, searching for unbranded mavericks or stray cattle he could drive to the railhead. He pushed his ruined shoulder far past its limit, swinging a rope with his left, fighting the brush, and refusing to surrender to the shooting agony in his collarbone. Matilda stayed near the homestead, chopping the last of the winter wood, but her eyes constantly scanned the horizon. She understood what Silas was doing. He was a man who had built his entire life on his ability to provide. Losing his land was a death sentence to his spirit, but sacrificing his honor to save it was something he simply would not do. It was nearing dusk when Silas finally rode back into the yard. He had no strays. His face was gray with pain. As he dismounted, his knees buckled. Matilda was there instantly. She caught his good arm, holding him steady. She noticed the fresh blood seeping through the canvas fabric of his shirt. He had torn the healing stitches in his shoulder. She helped him into the house and sat him at the wooden table. Lighting the oil lamp, she brought a basin of warm water and clean rags. Silas did not protest this time. He sat in defeated silence, his head bowed, as she carefully unbuttoned his bloody. Her massive hands, calloused from years of driving spikes and swinging mauls, moved over his bruised skin with astonishing gentleness. She washed the torn wound, her thick fingers applying pressure with perfect, careful restraint. I failed, Silas whispered to the empty room. Tomorrow I will ride to town. I will sell the mare and my father's watch. I will beg the banker for a loan, but it will not be enough. Matilda bandaged his shoulder, her heart aching as she watched the pride drain out of the strongest man she had ever known. She realized then that love was not just about finding someone who made you feel safe. Love was about deciding what you were willing to give up to keep them safe. That night, after Silas finally fell into a feverish, exhausted sleep, Matilda sat at the small table. The dim lantern light flickered over the blank labor contract Miller had left behind. Silas had given her back her dignity. He had stood between her and the cruelty of the world. Now it was her turn to stand between him and his ruin. Selling her labor was no longer a humiliation if she chose to do it for someone she loved. It was a sacred sacrifice. Matilda picked up the pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and signed her name at the bottom of the page. Sunday morning dawned quiet and still. Silas opened his eyes, the sunlight streaming across the floorboards. He felt a strange emptiness in the house. He walked into the kitchen. The iron stove was cold. On the table, sitting squarely beneath his tin coffee cup, was a folded piece of paper. Silas pulled it free. It was a short note, written in a careful, heavy hand. You gave me a place to stop walking. Now let me save your home. Do not come looking for me. Silas dropped the note, his heart hammering against his ribs. He ran out to the porch, looking down the road toward Miller's property. The yard was empty. The giant woman was gone. Silas stood on the front porch, the scrap of paper trembling in his left hand. The cool morning breeze swept across the empty yard, carrying the bitter scent of dry dust. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over him, completely drowning out the throbbing ache in his collarbone. She had gone to give herself away. She had walked into 2 years of backbreaking timber servitude to save a ranch that was not even her. Silas turned and marched toward the barn, his jaw set like iron. He did not care that his right arm was bound tight against his ribs. He did not care that every breath sent a flare of heat through his chest. He reached down with his left hand, grabbing the saddle horn of the 40-pound leather rig lying in the dirt. He braced his boots, pressed his ribs against the wooden stall, and with a guttural roar, unyielding willpower, he heaved the heavy saddle up. Using his chest, his knee, and his one good arm, he dragged the rig up and over the back of the bay mare. The mare stood perfectly still, turning her dark eyes to nick softly against his cheek. Silas leaned his forehead against her neck, breathing through the blinding pain. He gripped the cinch strap in his teeth, pulling it tight with his left hand until the saddle was locked in place. He had failed to saddle his mare when his pride was on the but he would not fail now when Matilda's freedom was at stake. Silas hauled himself into the saddle and swung the bay mare south, riding hard toward Miller's ranch. 3 miles down the ridge, the sun was rising over Miller's sprawling yard. A heavy timber wagon stood near the main barn, its iron-rimmed wheels caked with mountain mud. Standing beside the wagon was a thick-necked, brutal-looking timber recruiter named Vance, holding a pouch of coin. Beside him stood Miller, a greedy grin stretched across his face. And standing near the tailgate, her head bowed and her long blonde hair falling like a shield over her face, was Matilda. Her massive shoulders were tight, her thick biceps pulled inward as if she were trying to disappear inside her slate blue dress. She signed it, Miller was saying, holding up the paper Matilda had inked hours before. She is yours for 2 years, Vance. $500 like we agreed. Hold your horses. Silas's voice cut through the morning air like a rifle shot. The bay mare skidded to a halt in the center of the yard. Silas dismounted awkwardly, dropping to the dirt and stepping directly between Matilda and the timber boss. His face was pale and slick with sweat, but his eyes were blazing with a fierce, danger. The paper is no good, Silas said, his voice deadly calm. Miller sneered, stepping forward. You do not have a say in this, Silas. She walked here on her own 2 feet. She put her name on the contract. It is a legal debt transfer. Silas ignored Miller completely. He turned his back on the cattleman and looked up at Matilda. Her blue eyes were brimmed with unshed tears, wide with horror and heartbreak that he had come for her. "Why, Matilda?" Silas asked softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Why would you do this?" Matilda swallowed hard, her broad chest heaving. "Because it is all I am worth, Silas," she whispered, her voice cracking with the agonizing truth she had carried for half her life. "When I was 17, my own father sold my labor to a freight outfit in Missouri because he was ashamed of my size and wanted the cash. I spent 3 years pulling loaded wagons out of river mud like a mule before I ran away. I learned a long time ago that nobody is ever going to want me as a woman, Silas. I am just a freak with a strong back. And if I have to be sold again, I wanted it to be to save the only man who ever treated me like a human being." The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow, tearing deeper than any injury he had ever suffered. Her silence, her fear of being looked at, her willingness to work until her fingers bled. It was not just humility. It was the deep, festering belief that her life had no value except as a tool to be used by others. Silas stepped closer to her, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and reached out with his good left hand. He took her massive, calloused right hand in his own, holding it tightly in front of Miller and the timber agent. "You are not a freak, Matilda," Silas said, looking directly into her tear-filled eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And you are not a draft horse. You are the most generous, courageous, and beautiful woman I have ever known. My land is just dirt and timber. It means nothing to me. But you mean everything." Matilda stared at him, her lips parting as the words washed over her starved soul. For the first time in her life, someone was choosing her over property, over security, over everything. Silas turned to Miller, snatched the signed labor contract from the cattleman's hand, and tore it in half. He ripped it again and again, tossing the white scraps into the dust at Miller's boots. Vance, the timber boss, looked at the torn paper, then at Silas's fierce gaze, and finally at Matilda. "I am not getting mixed up in a forced labor dispute," Vance grunted, pulling his money pouch back into his coat. "Find your heavy haulers somewhere else, Miller." Vance climbed onto his wagon and whipped his horses, rolling out of the yard. Miller's face turned purple with rage. "You fool!" Miller screamed at Silas. "You tore up your only way out. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, the county sheriff puts your deed on the courthouse steps in town. You will not have a roof over your head by noon. I would rather sleep in the dirt with my self-respect than live in a mansion paid for with her." "Freedom," Silas replied. He led the bay mare to a wooden mounting block, helping Matilda onto the horse's back before swinging up behind her. As they rode away from Miller's yard, Matilda leaned back against Silas's chest, her heavy shoulders relaxing for the first time since she had walked onto his ranch. They were heading back to a home they would lose in less than 24 hours, but as Silas held the reins with his left hand, feeling the warm, steady heartbeat of the giant woman against his chest, he knew the real battle for their future was just beginning. The ride back to the homestead was quiet, the steady cadence of the bay mare's hooves echoing against the hard dirt road. Matilda sat behind Silas, her hands resting lightly at his waist. For the first time in years, she did not feel the heavy, familiar urge to hide her broad frame or look away from the world. The warmth of Silas's back against her chest felt like a wall built between her and every cruel whisper she had ever endured. When they reached the ranch, the afternoon sun was casting long amber shadows across the clean porch and the neatly stacked woodpile. The wash house roof was tight, the cedar posts stood straight along the south ridge, and the water trough was filled to the brim. In less than a week, Matilda had poured her massive physical power into repairing every broken corner of the property. Yet as Silas dismounted and looked across the yard, he did not see timber and dirt. He saw the sanctuary they had built together. "Come inside," Silas said softly, holding open the front door for her. They sat at the small wooden kitchen table, Silas reached into his canvas shirt pocket and pulled out a small, worn flannel cloth. He unrolled it carefully on the rough wooden surface, revealing a heavy silver pocket watch engraved with his father's initials. It was the only heirloom he possessed, a prized memory of the man who had taught him how to work the frontier land with honor. "I kept this through hard winters and bad droughts," Silas said, his eyes fixed on the smooth, worn metal. "I held on to it because I thought if I lost it, I would lose who I was. I thought being a man meant keeping hold of what my father built, no matter what it cost me." He looked up at Matilda. Her long blonde hair framed a face filled with quiet compassion. Her thick, powerful hands lay still on the table, no longer trembling with the shame Miller had tried to force upon her. "I was ready to let Miller take you so I could keep this dirt," Silas admitted, his voice rough with deep, honest regret. "I was so afraid of failing as a rancher that I nearly failed as a man. But losing this place means nothing if I lose my soul in the process." Matilda reached across the wooden table. Her massive, calloused fingers gently covered his hand and the silver watch. "You did not fail, Silas," she said softly, her blue eyes shining with warmth. "You stood up for me when no one else ever had. You taught me that my strength is not a curse, and that I do not have to hide from the world to be safe. If we lose this land tomorrow, we will walk away together. You are a builder, Silas. You can build a home anywhere." Silas looked at her, feeling a deep, quiet peace settle over his heart. He turned his hand beneath hers, lacing his fingers through her massive. For a long moment, no words were needed. The unspoken truth rested between them. They were no longer two lonely outcasts fighting the frontier alone. They had become a family. That night, neither of them slept much, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. When the first light of dawn broke over the horizon on Monday morning, Silas dressed in his finest canvas shirt and brushed his weathered cowboy hat. He walked out to the yard and found Matilda waiting by the bay mare. She was dressed in her simple slate blue dress, her strong shoulders squared and her head held high. She did not try to pull her torn sleeves down to hide her thick biceps. She did not look at the dirt. "I am coming with you to town," she said, her voice steady and resolute. Silas smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his observant eyes. "I would not have it any other way." They rode into town together, arriving at the county courthouse just as the morning church bell chimed 9 o'clock. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered on the wooden steps, whispering among themselves in the crisp air. Miller stood near the front, flanked by his ranch hands, holding a fat leather pouch of gold coin. Sheriff Higgins stood at the top podium, holding the legal tax deed for Silas's ranch. Silas dismounted and offered his good left hand to help Matilda down. As her tall, heavily muscled frame stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, several townspeople gasped and murmured at her incredible size and physical power. But Matilda did not flinch or shrink back. She stood tall beside Silas, her presence imposing and majestic, holding her chin high. Silas took her hand publicly in front of the entire settlement, letting every soul in town see that he was proud to stand beside her. Miller turned and sneered, stepping up to the sheriff's podium. "Let us get on with it, Higgins. $500 in back taxes. Here is the cash. Put the deed in my name." "Hold on, Sheriff," Silas called out, stepping toward the steps. His voice was firm, ringing clear across the quiet street. "I have a right to redeem my land before the final gavel." Miller laughed aloud, a harsh, mocking sound. "With what, Silas? You do not have $50 to your name." Silas stepped onto the bottom stair, pulling his father's silver watch from his pocket and placing it on the podium alongside his land title and a handwritten pledge for his remaining cattle. "I offer my father's watch, my stock, and my word to pay the remaining debt by harvest," Silas said, addressing the crowd and the sheriff. "I have worked this land with honor for 15 years. Sheriff Higgins looked at the watch, then at Silas, hesitation clear in his eyes. He knew Silas was an honest man who kept his word. But Miller stepped forward, slamming his heavy fist on the podium. The law specifies cash on the barrelhead. Sheriff, Miller shouted. No promises. No watches. I bid $500 in gold right now. Sheriff Higgins sighed, looking at Silas with deep regret. He raised his wooden gavel into the air. The law is clear, Silas. Cash takes precedence over property pledges. I have $500 from Miller. Going once. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. He looked back at Matilda, whose hand gripped his with unyielding warmth and he had risked everything for her dignity, and now his father's ranch was slipping away in seconds. Going twice, Sheriff Higgins called out, bringing the heavy wooden gavel high above the podium. Silas braced himself for the strike of the gavel, wondering if anyone in the silent crowd would find the courage to challenge Miller's greed before the homestead was lost forever. The heavy wooden gavel hovered in the crisp morning air, a fraction of a second away from striking the podium and ending Silas's life on the frontier. Silas stood perfectly still, his left hand gripping Matilda's massive fingers, anchoring himself to the only thing that truly mattered anymore. Hold your strike, Sheriff. A deep, rough voice echoed across the quiet street. The crowd parted as a broad-shouldered man wearing a soot-stained leather apron pushed his way to the front of the courthouse steps. It was Elias, the town blacksmith. He stopped at the bottom stair, pulling a heavy canvas coin purse from his belt. He looked up at Silas, then glanced respectfully at the wildly muscular woman standing by his side. 2 weeks ago, Elias said, his voice loud enough for the entire assembly to hear, a runaway freight wagon came tearing through town. My old farm dog was chained to the trough. This rancher here dove into the dirt, threw my dog clear, and took the wagon shaft to his own shoulder. He did not ask for a reward. He did not even ask for a bandage. He just checked the animal, tipped his hat, and walked away. Elias stepped up to the podium and dropped the heavy purse next to Silas's silver pocket watch. I bid $50 in gold for a share of his cattle pledge. A man who takes a hit for a chained dog is a man who pays his debts. Miller's face flushed a dark, furious red. You cannot do this, Elias. This is a tax auction. It is a public bid for a legal pledge, Miller, Sheriff Higgins corrected mildly, a sudden, knowing smile touching his lips. And the blacksmith's coin spends just as well as yours. Before Miller could protest further, the general store owner stepped out from the crowd. He laid a stack of greenbacks on the podium. Silas has run a tab at my counter for 15 years and settled it every harvest without fail. I will take $50 of that pledge. Then came the livery master, the telegraph operator, and a dozen ordinary frontier folk. They were quiet, hard-working people who knew the terrible weight of a bad season. They stepped forward one by one, dropping coins and crumpled bills onto the wooden podium. They looked at Silas, standing tall despite his ruined shoulder, and they looked at Matilda. They did not see a freak of nature or a giant attraction. They saw a woman who had worked her hands to the bone to save a man she believed in, and they saw a man willing to lose everything to protect her dignity. Within minutes, the pile of money beside the silver watch surpassed the back taxes. Sheriff Higgins picked up his gavel. $500 for the cattle pledge has been raised by the community. He brought the heavy wooden mallet down with a sharp, final crack. The deed remains with Silas. Miller stood in the dust, his mouth working silently. Defeated by the very community he had tried to exploit, he turned and shoved his way through the crowd, riding out of town with his men trailing behind him in bitter silence. Silas reached out with his left hand and picked up his father's silver watch. He turned to Elias and the gathered townsfolk, a humbling gratitude shining in his observant eyes. I will repay every one of you by the harvest, Silas promised, his voice thick with emotion. You have my word. Elias smiled, tipping his hat to Matilda. We know you will, Silas. Take your family home. By the time the first deep frost of late November covered the prairie, the struggling ranch had transformed. The bitter heat of the summer was gone, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of wood smoke and pine. Silas's right shoulder had finally healed. It still carried a dull ache when the cold wind blew, but he had regained his strength. Yet, he no longer felt the desperate need to prove his independence by doing everything alone. When morning broke, they walked out to the barn together. Silas lifted the heavy, 40-pound leather saddle, but he did not heave it alone. Matilda stepped beside him, her massive hand resting gently over his, and together they swung the rig over the back of the bay mare. The wash-house roof held tight against the snow, and the heavy cedar posts along the south ridge stood like iron sentinels against the winter storms. Matilda no longer kept to the corners of the rooms. She wore a simple, warm wool dress, but she no longer tried to hide the terrifying physical power of her thick biceps or the heavy width of her shoulders. She moved through the homestead with a quiet, majestic grace, her long blonde hair catching the morning light. The cruel whispers of her past had faded entirely, replaced by the steady, unshakable respect of the man who worked by her side. That evening, a warm fire crackled in the iron stove. The silver pocket watch rested safely on the wooden mantel, ticking in the quiet room. Silas walked to the small kitchen table and set 2 tin cups of black coffee on the rough boards. He sat down across from Matilda, looking at her resolute, beautiful face. He reached out, lacing his calloused fingers through her massive one. "The day you walked into my barn, you asked for a deal," Silas said softly, the flickering firelight reflecting in his eyes. "You asked for a place to stop walking." Matilda smiled, a gentle, radiant warmth filling her blue eyes. "And you gave me one, Silas." "I want to make a new deal," Silas murmured, his grip tightening gently on her heavy hand. "I do not just want you to stop walking, Matilda. I want you to be my wife. I want this to be your home, from now until the end of our days." Matilda looked at the man who had seen past her towering size, the man who had stood between her and the cruelty of the world, and the man who had finally taught her what it meant to belong. She brought his hand to her lips, pressing a tender kiss against his weathered knuckles. "It is a deal, Silas," she whispered. And as the winter wind rushed across the wild frontier, the quiet cowboy and the giant woman sat together in the warm light of the home they had saved, no longer broken, no longer hiding, and never alone again. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and reflective storytelling. All characters, names, dialogue, events, towns, ranches, and circumstances are fictional or dramatized. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to actual events or places is coincidental. Historical details are used to create a frontier atmosphere and may be simplified or adapted for narrative purposes. Nothing in this story should be understood as historical documentation or as legal, medical, financial, or other professional advice. The story is intended for a general audience and explores universal themes such as dignity, compassion, resilience, forgiveness, belonging, family, and second chances.